Today, I'm going to share with you 3 extremely haunting stories about people who witnessed death up close, and then how that experience completely altered their entire perspective about what is possible in life. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button some pistachio ice cream, but actually fill their ice cream cone with wasabi. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Late one night in 1870, a Harvard medical student named James Adams walked down a dark street toward the gate of a cemetery in the quiet town of Malden, Massachusetts. And with him was his classmate William, who was carrying an unlit lantern. Once they reached the gate, they both stopped and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and then they helped each other climb over the gate. And once they were on the other side, they took off running straight down the cemetery path. And eventually, after running for a minute, they got to the other side of the cemetery and they came to a stop outside of a brick mausoleum that contained the remains of a man named Ephraim Gray, who had died 20 years earlier. So for years, James and William had been hearing all these rumors about this guy, Ephraim. In fact, many of their classmates had heard these rumors, and some people really believed they could be true. But tonight, James and William had snuck in here to this mausoleum to once and for all prove that those rumors were false. According to the rumors, when Ephraim was alive, so 20 years earlier, he'd been this very reclusive chemist who lived in a big house in the middle of town, and he had this one servant. And anytime people walked past his house, apparently they would always smell this really pungent chemical scent. And people believed that what Ephraim was doing in there to produce that smell was basically trying to come up with a potion that would make him immortal. He was basically running these strange experiments. However, clearly his experiments had not worked because Ephraim had died anyway. But when he died, his one servant had told the mortician not to embalm him, which was very unusual at the time. This was not a normal request. The servant had said that, even though Ephraim's elixir had not actually succeeded in keeping him alive forever, it had been successful at making his physical body immortal. The servant said, apparently, Ephraim's body would never decay. And so this story had become sort of a local legend. And decades later, lots of people in the area, in particular in Harvard Medical School, students actually believed it might be true, or they at least pretended it could be true. It was fun to believe. But James, as much as he wanted to, go along with the story, logically he felt like there is simply no way there could be any truth to this story. As a medical student, he knew that even the very best embalming techniques would only preserve a dead body for a few weeks at most. So there was no way Ephraim's body, that had been dead now for 2 decades, was not a pile of bones by now. And tonight, they were going to go find out. James knelt down in front of the mausoleum where Ephraim was entombed. And William struck a match and lit the lantern he had brought with him. And immediately the light from the lantern, it illuminated the door that led into the mausoleum, and they saw it was sealed shut with a padlock. So James, who's knelt down right next to the door, he pulled out a small hammer and a chisel, and he began to work on this lock. And eventually, he popped it open, he took the lock and put it on the ground, and then he stood up, and he and William were like, all right, here we go. And they pushed the door, and it slowly swung open. James stepped inside first, with William right behind him, holding up the lantern. And the space was cold and musty, and it was this kind of claustrophobic, all brick space that was covered in cobwebs. And on each side of the inside of this mausoleum were these big shelves with caskets sitting on each shelf. These were all different relatives of Ephraim's, and there were nameplates attached to each of these caskets. And so very quickly, James and William, they began looking, for the right casket that contained Ephraim. And eventually they found the right one, and they're sort of nervous at this point, but they're like, all right. And they got to either side of this casket, and together they pulled it off the shelf and put it down on the floor. And so James and William, they both went to the same side of the casket. And William, he's holding up his lantern, and they look at each other. They're like, all right, here we go. And James reaches down and he opens up the casket. And when they see what's inside, they can't believe it. Inside of this casket was definitely Ephraim's dead body. But even though Ephraim's clothing had clearly decayed into stringy brown mush, Ephraim himself did not look like he had been dead for 20 years. His skin was white and smooth, and there were no signs of decomposition on his body whatsoever. He was pristine. In fact, he looked like he was just sleeping, like he could just open his eyes and he'd be just fine. And so James and William are so spooked by this that they just instantly slam shut the casket, they turn, and they sprint out of the mausoleum, they flee the cemetery, and they pledge to never talk about this again. However, for the next few months, James just could not get the image of Ephraim's impossibly well-preserved body out of his head. Now, he still didn't believe the rumors that somehow, it's because of some potion that Ephraim drank that's made his body, immortal or something. But he read every chemistry book in the Harvard Library and could not find a scientific explanation for what he had seen. At the same time, James had another stress, which was he knew the Malden police were investigating the break-in at the mausoleum, and he was terrified that at some point, he and William were going to be found out. Desecrating a grave was a crime, and if James was actually arrested for it, he would get kicked out of medical school. But weeks turned into months, turned into years, and no police showed up at his door. So nobody figured out that he or William were involved in this break-in. And also, over this time, over these many years, he never figured out what actually had caused Ephraim's body to be that well preserved. But eventually, they just moved on with their lives. James graduated, he became a doctor, and he really just sort of forgot about the Ephraim thing. He just moved on. Until 30 years later, in 1900. At that point, James was in his 50s, and he was a successful doctor with his own medical practice in Boston. And one day, he was sitting in his office, catching up on some paperwork, when he heard a knock at the door. And so he called for whoever was out there to come in, and when the door opened up, he was very surprised to see a police officer. The officer told James that he was from the Malden Police Department, and he was looking into an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years earlier. Immediately, James felt sick to his stomach, and he was about to just start lying, saying he had nothing to do with it. But before he could say anything, the officer just said, look, multiple people in town have already told us that you and your friend William were responsible for that break-in. At this point, James knew he was caught, and there was no point in lying. Clearly, this officer knows what actually happened. And so James just rushed to explain sort of why they did it. He just said, look, there were these rumors that the body of Ephraim Gray didn't decompose because he apparently drank some, immortality potion, and we thought it was crazy. So we broke in just to look at the body. We just opened the casket, looked at the body, we shut it, we ran out. That was it. But the officer, after hearing this story, just narrowed his eyes and stared at James like he didn't believe him. And then when the officer went on to explain exactly why now, 30 years later, they were taking another look at this break-in, when he explained that, James literally just could not believe what he was hearing. So it would turn out the Malden Cemetery was in the process of being relocated. So workers were going through and moving every single grave. But when they got to Ephraim Gray's casket, they noticed it was unusually light. So they opened it up and found it was empty. There was no sign that anybody except for James and William had ever tampered with that mausoleum. And so basically, James and William were being accused of stealing Ephraim's body. But they both swore they didn't do that. They said they just went in, they looked at the body, were shocked that it had not decomposed, and they ran out. They didn't take the body. But police, during their investigation, saw that nobody else tampered with this casket except for James and William. So where did the body go? It was almost like Ephraim had simply woken up one day, looking as fresh as ever, opened up his coffin, and just walked out. And despite all of James and William's skepticism and all their medical training, they couldn't help but wonder if maybe somehow Ephraim's immortality potion had finally kicked in. Gas, groceries, eating out, even on the tightest of budgets, there's really no escaping nor controlling them. But here's what you definitely can control: getting cash back every single time you fill up, you hit the grocery store, or go out to eat with the Upside app. One thing I really like about Upside is that it doesn't require me to change anything I'm already doing. So before I fill up, I just check the app to see what offers are available nearby. It only takes a few seconds. And getting cash back on gas I was already going to buy is always a nice bonus. Here's how it works. Open the Upside app, claim an offer, pay with your card like normal, and get paid. That's it. And yes, it's cash back, not points you'll never use, not credits that expire. It's real money you transfer straight to your bank account. Upside has given back $1 billion to its users. To find out how much you could earn, download the free Upside app and use promo code MrBallen to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas using promo code MrBallen. Available to US consumers only. On the afternoon of January 28, 1945, an Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a wooden bench inside of a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. He was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors who were wearing white coats. All the lights were off in this church, and there was this religious hymn that was playing on a phonograph, which is like an early record player. And on the other side of the room, standing in front of a heavy locked door, were these two people, these two psychic mediums, who were twisting and groaning as if they were in pain. So the reason that Robert and everybody else, the other reporters, the doctors, were gathered here today was because of what was happening inside of that locked room. There was a man in there who was having his appendix removed. Now, usually, appendix removal was a routine surgery, and it would be performed without an audience and in a hospital instead of a back room in a church. But this operation was being performed by a very, very famous surgeon named Dr. Louise Gomes. And Dr. Gomes had only agreed to do the surgery under a couple of very odd conditions. So first, it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room, so that backed locked room, while he was working. Not even nurses or anesthesiologists, nobody. And third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with during this operation were those two psychic mediums standing outside the door. They wouldn't even be in the room with him, they'd be outside. And so after all these conditions were agreed to, before the surgery, the two mediums worked with the doctor to gather all the supplies and made sure they were in the back room. And then also they strapped the patient down to the operating table in the back room, and then they came out again. And then at that point, the reporter, Robert Cheney, and the other witnesses that were there to see this, the other reporters, the doctors, they helped board up all the windows of this back room of the church. And they also searched for any hidden passageways to make sure nobody could look into or sneak into or out of this back room, the operating room. And so eventually everything was ready, and Dr. Gomes and the patient were the only two people inside of this back operating room. It was all sealed off and locked. And then the instructions had been given to, Robert Cheney and the others to just take your seats in the church and wait. And so that's what Cheney and the others did. They just sat there sort of listening and watching, and nothing was going on. There's just this hymn playing from the phonograph, and the mediums are doing like weird stuff in front of the door, apparently communicating with the doctor, but the whole thing was just sort of absurd. Honestly, Robert didn't really know what to make of this. But when he had caught wind that there was going to be this totally bizarre procedure done, he had come here not to validate that this was a smart or good way to do a surgery, but rather that this would just make a really wild story that people would be interested to read. But the longer Robert sat there listening and watching this totally bizarre scene unfold, the more he felt like he had sort of bitten off more than he could chew, that this was not really worth the time or energy. This was just really, really weird. However, as he's sitting there, sweating in the heat, just sort of waiting for this thing to be over, whatever it was, he overheard a couple of the doctors who were witnesses to this, along the pew with him, talking about Dr. Gomes. And what Robert heard is that these doctors are like, there is no way Dr. Gomes can perform this surgery. Like, he's not capable of performing this surgery. It's not possible. Not to mention, the doctors are also saying that, like, generally speaking, attempting to perform an appendectomy by yourself with no anesthesia, no nurses, no techs to help, was also just a terrible idea. Let alone, again, Dr. Gomes can't do this. There's no way. And so Robert, after hearing these doctors talk, he started to feel like, oh man, this whole thing's really unsettling. Like, now it's just creepy. You know, the sound of the hymn and the mediums writhing around, you know, presumably communicating with this famous doctor through the locked door. And it's like, please let this end. This is so awful. And he was just staring over at the mediums and the locked door, and suddenly the mediums just stopped. But Robert just continued to sit there with the other witnesses for over another hour. They've been in there now for like 2+ hours, and it's just this horrible scene. But eventually, this booming voice came out of the back room. The doors weren't open yet. The voice was just coming from inside of that room, and the voice yelled that the operation was now over. Robert, at this point, looked over at those two doctors who had sort of voiced their own concerns, and they kind of exchanged a look like, what are we going to see in there? But they had waited this long, they really wanted to see, so they all stood up and they made their way over to the door. When they got to the door, the two mediums stepped out of the way, and then one of the two doctors that was with Robert, they just reached down and tried the door handle, and they found it was now unlocked. And so the lights are on at this point inside the church. This is the first time they're gonna see what's inside of this, you know, magical operating room, and they open the door, and the doctors walk in, and Robert follows right behind them, and they look around. And at first, it was just really weird. Like, there was really nothing strange in the room. The patient is right in the middle of the room. He's on an operating table. He has fresh stitches right on his side, suggesting he's just had surgery. And literally next to him on the table is a jar with his appendix sitting inside of it, floating in liquid. The surgery had been a success. The patient was okay. However, there was a catch. The surgeon, the famous surgeon, Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. He was not back here. And the reason is because Dr. Luis Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. And it was because the surgeon was dead that all these people, Robert, the two doctors, the other reporters, it's why they were brought here, to bear witness to this unbelievable thing. Because the people who organized this knew that if they didn't have witnesses, nobody would ever believe that this had happened. Even though a dozen witnesses, including Robert Cheney, those doctors, the other reporters, were there in the church that day, and they swore that no living doctor ever went in that back room. They didn't go in during, before, after the surgery. Nobody came out, even though they swore, basically, that the patient was effectively alone in that room. Despite that, X-rays would confirm that the patient had had an appendectomy on that day, that his appendix really was removed, and apparently it was removed by a very highly skilled surgeon. And so, this remains the only surgery on record to have been officially performed by a ghost. At 5 a.m. on the morning of December 5th, 1957, a 74-year-old woman named Frances Bowles woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco, California. And before she opened her eyes, Frances just had this feeling, this sense, that somebody else was in the room with her. But she wasn't bothered by this because she knew it had to be her husband, Gene. So Gene was 82 years old, and he'd been really, really sick for the past couple of years. And recently, he'd begun sleeping in their guest bedroom, so he wouldn't wake Frances up with all his tossing and turning at night. But then in the mornings, he would often come and join her in bed. And so she's assuming that's what's going on. Gene must have joined me in the middle of the night, and he's next to me in bed. However, when Frances did open her eyes, she saw there was someone else in the room, but it was not Gene. So Frances was lying on her side on the edge of the bed, looking outward. And her perspective, from her head, the way she was positioned, is she was sort of looking down towards the ground when she first opened her eyes. And the first thing she saw when she was looking off the side of the bed were these very distinctive shoes standing, with somebody's legs right next to the bed, basically standing facing her. And she sees these old-fashioned polished dress shoes with very thick heels and a piece of gray fabric buttoned over the ankles, like the way men used to wear back in the late 1800s. Like, these are distinctive and old shoes. And it was actually these shoes that immediately gave away that this was not Jean, because Jean did not own a pair of shoes like that. Frances would know. And as her eyes traveled up from these strange shoes, she saw this was clearly a man, and he had skinny legs, and he was wearing black and gray striped pants, and he had a very small body overall, and he was wearing a white vest with a long black coat with coattails. And then as Frances finally reached this man's head, she saw he had these strikingly blue eyes, and he was looking right at her, and he had this almost mocking grin on his face. And Frances has no idea who this person is. There is a stranger in her house. She's thinking he's broken in. What's he gonna do to me? And she just sat up in her bed and she looked at this guy, and he leaned forward and he just kind of continued to smile, and he said, "I'm here for Jean." Frances just began to scream at the top of her lungs. But this man, this strange little man with blue eyes, just began to laugh. And then, to Frances's total disbelief, he vanished. A second later, Frances heard footsteps, and then the bedroom door flew open, and Jean burst in asking what was wrong. And without thinking, Frances blurted out that there had been somebody in her room. But as she told Jean all about this strange little man and his weird outfit with his blue eyes and how he vanished, she started to realize that what she was saying sounded absurd. And from Jean's expression, she could tell that he did not believe her. He's thinking, you were having a dream, clearly, like there's no way this happened. And so even though to Frances, the experience she had just had felt 100% real, by the time she was done telling the story and sort of going over it with Jean, she was starting to think that, maybe she had like a very lucid, vivid dream. However, just to be safe, Frances and Jean spent a few minutes walking all around the house, making sure nobody else was here, and also looking for, any signs that maybe somebody had broken in, but there were none. However, Jean did find that the front door was unlocked, which definitely was not something he did. He remembered locking the door before bed, and Frances said she never unlocked it, so that was sort of a strange thing. But other than that, the house was in normal order. And so Frances and Jean, they didn't really know what to do. I mean, they did debate calling the police, but they had no evidence that this actually happened, and they both agreed that the story was just too strange for anyone to believe. And so by 7 a.m. that morning, so just a little while after this whole thing happened, Frances felt pretty convinced that there had been no little man in a room with blue eyes, and this really had just been a very lucid, horrible dream. And so the two of them began to go about their normal morning routine when Jean really started to feel sick. I mean, he was already not doing well in the, weeks prior, but he really just started to deteriorate really quickly. This is like, 15, 20 minutes after this little man has popped up in her nightmare or whatever. Jean starts falling apart, to the point where Frances actually called his doctor and said, "You gotta come here right now. Something's wrong with Jeannie. He's fallen apart here." By 8 a.m., when the doctor showed up, this is now about an hour after, Frances has had whatever experience she had, whether it was a nightmare or real, they don't know. But this is an hour later, the doctor shows up, and by this point, Jean is like wrecked. He's practically on his deathbed. He's falling apart. He gets rushed to the hospital, and all day that day, they're trying to save him. But by the very next morning, he had died. And then as time went on, whenever she would think about that strange experience, the little man in her room, she would just rationalize it and tell herself that that was just her own mind's way of working out her growing anxiety over Jean's mortality. I mean, after all, he had died literally within 24 hours of that vision, and so maybe that was just her mind's way of getting ready for Jean's death. However, despite telling herself this story and feeling pretty good about that being what this whole thing was, what she could never quite figure out was how her subconscious had created such a strange character with such a weirdly specific wardrobe. She knew she had never seen anybody like that before in her whole life. So how did her mind come up with this really vivid character? But she ultimately just pushed this whole thing out of her mind and didn't talk to anybody about this experience. Well, that is until a few months later. Late one night in the spring of 1958, so a few months after Jean's death, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter, whose name was Jane, were driving down a freeway in Northern California, coming home from a road trip they had taken as sort of a celebration of Jean's life. And so as they're driving along, both women are looking out the window, they're not really talking, and the radio wasn't on, and so the only sound was the sound of the tires on the road. It was just very quiet. But then sort of out of nowhere, Jane spoke up and told her mother about something really weird that had happened to her on the morning of Jean's death. And she couldn't stop thinking about it, and it bothered her so much, she just had to tell her mom. According to Jane, she had woken up on that morning, and standing in her room on the other side was this little man with these strange polished shoes, striped pants, black coat with coattails, and these bright blue eyes, who was looking right at her and grinning. And when Frances heard this, she couldn't believe it. And she blurted out to her daughter that she had never told anybody except for Jean, but on that morning, she had seen the exact same man in her bedroom. And so for the rest of the ride, the mother and daughter just compare notes, talking about the whole experience, exactly what they remember, exactly what he looked like, how they felt, like what they thought it meant. And then at some point, towards the end of this sort of revelation they're both having, where they're both realizing they've had this shared experience, Frances says something that catches Jane's attention. Frances says, yeah, and then, right before he vanished, he told me he was here for Jean, and then, your dad died 24 hours later. And Jane, when she heard this, she goes quiet, and she looks at her mom, and she's like, that's not what he said to me. And Frances is like, what do you mean? Like, what did he say to you? And Jane, she's just looking straight ahead. She's driving and she goes, he said, I'm here for Jane. He was here for me. For a moment, the car just went totally quiet and neither woman knew what to say. But then Frances was like, well, wait a minute. I know the little man said to me, I'm here for Jean. And then 24 hours later, your dad died. Jean died. And so it sort of seemed like they were connected. And you're saying that the same thing happened to you. You've had the exact same experience as me on the same morning, the same time frame that I know he said, I'm here for Jean, and you think he said, I'm here for Jane? But you're still alive, and that was months ago. You must have just misheard him. He must have said, I'm here for Jean, same as me, and you just thought he said Jane. And so pretty quickly, both women agreed that that had to have been what happened. They had the exact same experience, and in both cases, this guy has said he's here for Jean. Has to be what happened. However, Frances would be wrong. Because on December 7th, 1958, exactly a year and 1 day after Jean died, Frances's daughter, Jane, died as well. It would turn out she had not been perfectly healthy as she and her mother believed when she saw this little man in the strange outfit with the blue eyes. She had had cancer that likely had just cropped up but had gone undetected. And now, by the time doctors were realizing she had it, it was too late. It had spread to the point where there was nothing they could do. Following her daughter's death, Frances was so overcome with grief that she poured her energy into basically just telling everyone she could about this little man that she had seen before her husband's death and her daughter had claimed to have seen before she died. It just felt like, we gotta tell people about this, like what happened? And she even ended up writing to a journalist to try to get this story out there, to try to figure out what the heck that was. However, nobody came forward with any sort of meaningful explanation about what this experience was, what it meant, how real it was. No one knew what to make of it. However, after getting the story out there and describing in agonizing detail every little thing that she remembered from this experience, Frances did learn one piece of information that does seem to begin to explain who this little man was. That man's outfit, the old-fashioned dress shoes, the striped pants, the white vest, the black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession. The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Yet another attempt to destroy evidence. And so at this point, Henderson was getting pretty worried, because the killer clearly had taken a lot of steps to cover their tracks. And if they had done a thorough enough job and the police couldn't find any usable fingerprints or DNA, they'd be relying primarily on witnesses, which are not necessarily hugely reliable. So Henderson just really hoped that was not going to be the case here. But if it was, he just prayed that someone in the neighborhood had seen something. 10 minutes later, Henderson walked down the icy sidewalk, canvassing the neighborhood with his partner, Detective Manacchio. And as they walked, Manacchio filled Henderson in on the talk that he had just had with Diane's parents. What he'd learned was that Diane had recently moved to this neighborhood and that she also dated a lot, mostly men that she met online. And the fact that she dated a lot of people certainly caught Henderson's attention, because all the evidence that they had found so far in Diane's house suggested that she had been killed by somebody she knew. There were no signs of forced entry, and there was evidence of a long, very deliberate cleanup. So the killer had clearly felt comfortable enough to stick around after the murder and had probably known Diane was single, so they were not going to be interrupted. And so Henderson sort of filed these thoughts away as he and his partner arrived at the next house on the block. Henderson knocked, and a moment later, an elderly woman answered the door. And at that point, Henderson explained about Diane's murder, and then he asked her if she had seen anything suspicious around Diane's place the previous day. Cars parked outside or, strange people coming and going, anything. Now, this woman was immediately startled by the news of a murder in this neighborhood. That definitely was the primary reaction she had. But, she quickly recovered and said that no, she hadn't seen anything. However, she did remember seeing some kids playing in the yard across the street from Diane's, so maybe they had seen something. Moments later, Henderson and Menacchio stood on the front porch of the house that was directly across the street from Diane's, and they were speaking to a woman in her 50s who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Yearwood. When Henderson explained about the murder across the street, Mrs. Yearwood gasped and said that, she hadn't known Diane particularly well. I mean, she was new to the neighborhood, but she had always been so friendly to her and her family. And in fact, Diane had even paid Mrs. Yearwood's son to help with some small chores around her house. At this point, Henderson sort of, shifted the conversation and just got to the point. He told her that he had heard that there had been some kids playing outside this house the previous day. And were the kids home? Because he really wanted to speak to them to see if they had maybe heard or seen anything strange on Diane's property the day before. Mrs. Yearwood immediately nodded and turned around and walked into the back of the house, and then a moment later came back with an 11-year-old boy who looked very nervous. And so Henderson, to disarm him, immediately knelt down and touched him on the shoulder and just said, "Look, we're trying to catch a bad guy." And then Henderson pointed across the street and asked the boy had he seen anything strange at Diane's house the day before. The boy, at this point, looked past Henderson over at Diane's house and then back at Henderson, and he just shook his head and said no. And at this point, Henderson, he felt his stomach sink, because with a deeply contaminated crime scene and apparently no good witnesses, this case was already off to a horrible start. Around noon the following day, December 19th, Detective Henderson sat in his office reading through Diane Zaleski's autopsy report. He'd been anxiously waiting for this file all morning, but unfortunately it did not contain much information that he had not already guessed. Diane's time of death was estimated to be between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., so 11 to 14 hours before her parents found her body. She had been strangled and beaten and also stabbed more than 40 times. The damage was so severe, the medical examiner couldn't actually say which injury killed her. And also the knife that was used in the attack had never been found. They also couldn't tell if Diane had been sexually assaulted, because the chemicals that had been splashed on her body had destroyed any DNA the killer might have left behind. The forensics team also had not pulled any usable fingerprints from the house, thanks to the killer's cleanup efforts. But they did find something that was even better. There were a few drops of fresh blood at the crime scene that did not match Diane's DNA, and early tests showed that they came from an adult male. Now, it was possible that this blood was from someone other than the killer, but Henderson didn't think so. There had clearly been some sort of a struggle between the killer and Diane, so it seemed likely that Diane had managed to wound the killer and maybe draw blood, and maybe this was it. And so now, the game had changed. Henderson's next task would be to collect DNA samples from all the men closest to Diane and compare them to this fresh blood at the crime scene. Now, the digital forensics team had Diane's laptop, and they were working really hard to try to access her online dating profile to try to figure out who she'd been chatting with, because those were definitely some people they might want to compare DNA with. But while Henderson, thought that was great, he wasn't going to wait. He felt like he needed to move on this right now, and he figured if he wanted some answers about who Diane was potentially dating or seeing, or maybe who some of her exes were, he actually knew where he could go to start. Around 9:30 the next morning, Henderson was sitting in a coffee shop across from Diane's best friend, Joanne Govea. Joanne was clearly still processing the murder, and at the moment, she really seemed more angry than anything else. But she told Henderson that she would help any way she could, and that she did know all about the men who were in Diane's life. But of all her romantic partners, there was really only one who concerned her. His name was Mike Prunell, and according to Joanne, he'd been Diane's landlord years ago. After Diane had moved into his building, he'd started showering her with gifts and bugging her to go out with him, and they had ended up dating for a while. But when Diane ended things, Mike had been furious, and Diane had actually had to move to a new place just to get away from him. Now, this obviously got Henderson's attention, and he made a mental note to find Mike as soon as possible. But there was another name that he wanted to ask Joanne about as well. During the search of Diane's house, detectives had found her wallet in the kitchen sink. It had been sitting in the water. And inside of the wallet had been Diane's ID, some credit cards, and then there was also this soggy business card for someone named Mark Baker. And so Henderson asked if Joanne recognized that name. And Joanne said, "Yeah, I do." She said Diane had met Mark Baker at a bar, and they had talked and exchanged contact info, but Joanne didn't know if they'd ever actually followed up. And so Henderson and Joanne spoke for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped it up, and Henderson thanked Joanne for the help. And then as he was leaving, he decided that, he really needed to speak to both Mark and Mike, but he would start with Mark because he had his business card. Later that afternoon, Henderson led Mark Baker into the police station's interview room. He offered Mark a seat and a bottle of water, which Mark accepted before asking, what's going on? What is this all about? Mark definitely was pretty annoyed to have been asked to come down here in the middle of the workday with, virtually no explanation. So Henderson decided to just get straight to it. And he explained that he was investigating a murder. Then he pulled out a photo of Diane, put it on the table, and slid it over to Mark. Now, as Henderson did this, he was sort of studying Mark for any sort of reaction when he saw Diane's picture. But Mark just sort of glanced at the photo and then back up at Henderson, and he said, "Am I supposed to know who this is?" And this totally caught Henderson off guard. Henderson told him that the woman's name was Diane, and he knew that Mark had met her at a bar not that long ago. But Mark just shook his head and insisted that that had not happened. He said he definitely didn't know Diane, and he also would not have chatted her up anywhere, because she apparently was not the kind of, quote, target he usually went for. And that word, target, sort of hung in the air very uneasily between them for a long time. And then eventually Henderson just sort of, cleared his throat and asked if Mark would be willing to give a DNA sample. And Mark flat out refused. But this only made Henderson even more determined to get a sample. Now, he couldn't force it without a warrant, but he had another idea. Mark had been drinking from that water bottle that he had given him when he first came in, and he just hoped if Mark left it behind, Henderson could scoop it up and send it off for testing. So he told Mark that he was free to go. But Henderson was disappointed when Mark did not throw the bottle away. Instead, he put the cap back on, pocketed the bottle, and he left. Now, Henderson obviously couldn't prove this, but just from the looks of it, the decision to take the bottle like that, it felt deliberate. And it reminded him of just how careful Diane's killer had been to remove forensic evidence from the crime scene. So he gave Mark a few seconds head start, and then eventually Henderson got up and actually followed Mark out of the station, but kept his distance so that he wouldn't notice he was behind him. And Henderson very carefully trailed Mark all the way down the block. And then at some point, when Mark stopped and sort of looked around for a moment, Henderson froze until he realized Mark was just checking street signs. And then, Mark just kept on walking and Henderson kept on trailing until eventually Mark pulled out that bottle and he chucked it onto the ground. And then as soon as Mark had walked down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared, Henderson ran over, put on a rubber glove, picked up that bottle, and went right back to the police station. And then as soon as he got there, he put it inside of an evidence bag and he sent it off to the crime lab for testing. That evening, around 6 p.m., Henderson was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen in total frustration. He was reading the results of a database search for Diane's ex-boyfriend and former landlord, Mike Prunell, and he was running into a problem. Henderson could not find anybody with that name. A moment later, Henderson heard a knock at his door, and he called for whoever it was to come on in. And then when the door opened, he saw his partner, Detective Minacchio, standing there with a middle-aged man. And Minacchio explained that this guy was Diane's brother, Ron Zaleski, and he was here to give whatever information he could about Diane's personal life. And Henderson immediately perked up because he realized that, Ron very likely knew Diane's ex-boyfriends and any current boyfriends. So as they sat down, Henderson asked him if he remembered a man named Mike Purnell. And Ron immediately paused and looked really surprised, and then said, yeah, he knows exactly who Mike is. Because at one point, Mike had actually asked their father for his blessing to marry Diane. According to Ron, none of the family had been in love with that idea, because Mike had seemed like a really shady guy. In fact, he had such a long rap sheet that he didn't even go by his real name. Two days later, on November 22nd, Detective Henderson sat in the interview room across from the man who called himself Mike Purnell. His real name was Lou Hubbard, and at this point, Henderson knew that amongst his rap sheet was a conviction for domestic violence against his ex-wife. Apparently, he had savagely beaten her, and Henderson knew that obviously in this murder case, Diane had been savagely beaten, so there's, a similarity there. Now, Henderson had not told Lou that they knew his real name, and he also hadn't told Lou why he was even here, and Lou hadn't asked. And at the moment, Lou was just sort of leaning back in his chair, sort of like making light of this whole thing, like it was totally hilarious that he was being held inside of a police station. At some point, Henderson asked Lou where he had been on November 17th, and Lou just sort of shrugged and said he couldn't remember anything about that day, like it didn't stand out at all to him. At this point, Henderson pulled out that photo of Diane and he slid it across the table to Lou. And Lou, he just glanced at it and then slid it back across the table and said he had no idea who that was. And to Henderson, this was just completely unbelievable, like literally not believable. Because he knew that Lou had literally proposed to Diane, this woman in the photo. So there was no way he did not recognize her. He had to be lying. At this point, Henderson stood up from the table and he looked at Lou and said, if you want to keep playing dumb, that's fine. Then he stood up and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and he yelled out for his partner, Detective Minacchio, to bring him the file on Lou. And then a moment later, Minacchio ran down the hall, he handed over the file, and then Henderson went back to the table. Henderson, calm as could be, opened up the file and then began telling Lou that, I know your name's not Mike Purnell. It's Lou Hubbard. I know all about you. I know that at one point you were going to propose or did propose to this woman, Diane, the one in the photo, the one you claim not to know. We know all about it. We know about your criminal record, your domestic violence conviction. We know all about it. At this point, Lou's entire demeanor had changed. It was like he knew he'd been caught. And he just nodded and said, yeah, he knows who she is. And he also said that he had seen on TV that she had been murdered, but he swore he didn't do it. Now, Henderson really didn't believe the guy because he's just caught him lying. But he told him, hey, if you really didn't do it, there's an easy way to prove that. Give us a DNA sample, like literally right now. And after a long pause, Lou agreed. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, November 23rd, Detective Henderson was working at his desk when his phone rang. When he looked at the caller ID and he saw the extension, he knew it was the crime lab. And he assumed they must be calling to confirm receipt of Mark Baker and Lou Hubbard's DNA samples they had sent over. But when Henderson answered, the analyst on the line explained they were actually calling with an update from digital forensics. The digital team had finally accessed the browsing history on Diane's laptop, and they'd found some activity from the hours after Diane was killed. It looked like the killer, while hanging around inside of Diane's house after the murder, had viewed some pornographic websites, and then they'd also used Diane's credit cards to try and order a MacBook and an iPhone, and they had set the delivery address for these items for Diane's house. Now, Henderson was sort of taken aback by all of this, but what stood out was, well, if they're ordering these items to the scene of the crime, it means they planned on coming back to the scene of the crime. But there was also more. Apparently, the digital forensics team had finally gotten into Diane's dating profile, so now they could see everyone that she had messaged or gone out with in the past. And there were literally dozens and dozens of names. And so when Henderson heard that, he knew that now, there were all these new suspects, dozens of them. They would have to swab and question every one of those men. And so now the case had just totally exploded. Around noon on December 2nd, 2010, so about 2 weeks after Diane's murder, Detective Henderson sat in his car outside of an office building in Newark, New Jersey, watching the front entrance. He'd been there all morning, waiting for a worker whose name was Kyle Porter. Kyle was one of the men that Diane had been messaging with online before she was killed. Henderson had already spoken to him over the phone, and Kyle had actually confirmed that he had been to Diane's house just a few weeks before the murder. But what really made Henderson suspicious of Kyle was just the fact that he had refused to submit a DNA sample, even after Henderson explained that doing so would help clear him as a suspect. So now, as Henderson finally saw Kyle step out of the building and head for the parking lot, Henderson got out of his car and literally ran over to intercept him. And as he did, Henderson flashed his badge, and Kyle for a second looked like he maybe wanted to run, but instead he just sort of stammered that he was going to be late for his lunch meeting, sort of suggesting like, I can't talk to you right now. But Henderson had not waited around all morning just to leave empty-handed here. So he told Kyle that he could either give a sample right now and be on his way, or they could talk again when Henderson came back with a warrant for Kyle's arrest. And Kyle seemed terrified by that idea, so he sighed and said, okay, I'll give you a sample. 4 days later, on the morning of December 6th, Henderson was out jogging before his shift when his cell phone rang. He saw that it was the crime lab calling, so he stopped what he was doing and he answered the call. A forensic analyst from the lab was on the line, and he explained that he was calling because they just finished with the first batch of Henderson's blood samples. This batch included the samples for Mark Baker, the man who Henderson had to secretly trail just to pick up his water bottle, as well as Diane's ex-boyfriend, Lou Hubbard, aka Mike Prunell, and also Kyle Porter, the man she had met through online dating who, only after being threatened with arrest, offered up his DNA swab. And so Henderson held his breath as this analyst read off the results. And not one of them matched the blood sample from the crime scene. For a moment, Henderson thought there really had to be a mistake here, because all three of those men had been so suspicious and so uncooperative. Now, he'd always known that, the crime scene blood that he had tested their samples against maybe wasn't from the killer. But if that was true, then Henderson was really in trouble, because it meant that after all this, he had nothing. Now, the blood from the crime scene had already been tested against the state's DNA bank, and there had been no matches. And now he's got no matches here with these three suspects, and so Henderson knew he really had no choice but to keep finding and testing more suspects. And in the next few weeks and then months, he went through this process over and over, interviewing and obtaining DNA samples from the men in Diane's dating profile history and her email contacts, basically every man who had anything to do with her. He went out and interviewed and tested. In fact, over the next year, the detectives conducted more than 100 interviews and took over 80 DNA samples. But one by one, they all turned into dead ends. One morning in December of 2011, Detective Henderson was at his desk on the phone following up about a tip about Diane's case. So a month earlier, on the anniversary of Diane's death, the local news had aired a big special on the case. And then since then, the police station had been flooded with people calling in various tips. And so now, Henderson and Minacchio had their hands full following up on all these tips, but so far they had gone nowhere. And so Henderson thanked the person he was on the phone with, even though he sort of knew that what they were telling him was not going to be useful. Then he hung up and let out a frustrated sigh. He was starting to think that he had been totally wrong at the start of this murder, that Diane's killer was not someone she knew, but maybe a random intruder who would be even harder to catch. Or even worse would be, maybe the blood they had been testing all of these suspects against for the last year, that blood maybe didn't even belong to the killer. But just then, Minacchio burst into the office and he had a big grin on his face. And he said he had just gotten a call from this woman who had a story that Henderson needed to hear. Minacchio at this point just handed Henderson his cell phone, and so Henderson put the phone to his ear, and sure enough, there was a woman on the line. And this woman explained that she had an online friend that she spoke with all the time. Now, they'd never actually met in person, but they were still pretty close. And they told each other practically everything. And a few days ago, this online friend of hers had sent a very disturbing message where they openly admitted that they had killed Diane Zaleski. And when this woman told Henderson the actual name of this online friend of hers, he was so confused. But then it was like all at once, the world came crashing down around him because he realized that over a year ago, on the very first day he'd begun investigating Diane's murder, he had made a huge mistake. Based on forensic evidence from the crime scene and the killer's eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Diane Zaleski on the night of November 17, 2010. The killer was very nervous as they knocked on Diane's front door, because even though they had been here before, tonight was going to be different. Diane eventually came to the door, and she opened it up, and she seemed sort of surprised to see the killer there. But, she let them inside and asked them, like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And the killer, they hadn't really figured out how they were going to do this. And at some point, they just sort of blurted out the thing they wanted to tell her, which was to tell Diane that they had really intense feelings about her. But as they were sort of like rambling on about all these things they wanted to do with her and how they really just wanted her, Diane stopped them and told them that what they wanted was totally inappropriate and that now they needed to leave. But the killer, after being rejected, refused to leave. And then the killer began to argue. And as they did, they got angrier and angrier until they reached over and grabbed a pair of scissors on the table by the door, and they began stabbing Diane. But Diane, she immediately fought back way harder than the killer had expected, thrashing and kicking until the killer's grip on the scissors slipped. And at that point, the killer actually felt a flash of pain in their hand, and they looked down to see a bloody cut on their hand. But for the killer, this only made them more mad. The killer began to strangle her until finally she stopped moving. Once Diane was still, the killer took their hands off of her and then just sort of looked around at the incredibly bloody mess they'd made in the front of the house. They'd watched enough TV to know that their DNA and fingerprints were probably all over not just Diane's body, but all over the foyer right now. But they also knew that Diane, she lived alone, which meant that nobody was coming home anytime soon, and so they felt like they had plenty of time to clean up this mess. They started by dragging Diane's lifeless body down the hallway to the steps and then down into the basement. And then they cleaned her body with chemicals. And then after that, they went back upstairs and stripped off their own bloody clothes and started a load of laundry. And while they waited for their laundry to be done, the killer just sort of made themselves at home. They took a shower, they watched TV, they cooked and ate a bowl of pasta, and they used Diane's laptop to look at pornography and also do some online shopping with Diane's credit card. And then once the killer's clothes were clean and dry, they put them back on and then collected the items that they had handled, like Diane's wallet and her TV remote, and dumped them in the sink with a bunch of soapy water. Then they went around the house blasting everything with a fire extinguisher from under the sink to destroy trace evidence, and also they went ahead and wiped down the laptop to make sure there was no DNA or fingerprints on that as well. And then finally, sometime in the early hours of the morning after the murder, the killer, after having done all they could, they just casually walked out the door into the falling snow and crossed the street and went into their mother's house. Because the killer was Arnell Yearwood, Diane's neighbor's son. So the huge mistake that investigators made at the very beginning of this investigation was when they found out that the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Yearwood, that her son apparently did chores for Diane. Well, the mistake they made, in particular Detective Henderson, was when Mrs. Yearwood went into the back of the house and came back with that 11-year-old boy that they spoke to that said he didn't see anything strange across the street the day before, they assumed that boy was Mrs. Yearwood's son, and he was the one who was doing chores for Diane. And basically, they're like looking at this kid who's totally innocent, thinking, okay, clearly this kid who's been across the street in her house is not a person of interest. He did not kill anybody. And so the son of Mrs. Yearwood was just sort of forgotten about. What they didn't realize is that 11-year-old boy was not Mrs. Yearwood's son. It was her grandson. Her actual son was a 26-year-old man, Arnell Yearwood, who was actually inside the house on that day. He was hiding in her house. But they just never clarified. They assumed the kid was her son and just sort of wrote off any chance that her son could be involved. And so Detective Henderson and Minacchio didn't put it together until over a year later when they got that tip from that woman who said her online friend confessed to the murder, and his name was Arnell Yearwood. And so ultimately, Diane let Arnell into her house on the night she was killed because she knew and trusted him. He did chores at her house. But he tried to initiate a sexual relationship with her, she rejected him, and so he killed her. Arnell Yearwood was ultimately arrested on April 7, 2012, so about a year and a half after killing Diane. He would confess to the murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.